Maximum residue levels are basically the international equivalent of a tolerance. It's the amount of residue that's allowed on the harvested commodity. So like Japan may have a different tolerance level than the United States does, which might be different than the European Union countries. Okay, so just keep that in mind. I don't know if I have another poll here. So US tolerances and MRLs may not be exactly the same. Okay, so yes, let's go to this poll. Trying to remember.
Okay, so this one is asking, wow. Okay, my brain wasn't going to my mouth. There we go. When do you need to worry about whether or not you have exceeded the MRL, the maximum residue level? Shouldn't have tried to. That's correct, right,
Yes,
Lisa?
maximum residue level. I'm sorry, I should never put an acronym in the question.
No, that's okay. I started saying it and then I started second guessing myself. Okay. So when do you need to worry about whether or not you have exceeded the maximum residue level? When you are working with an export commodity, when you are preparing for an inspection, or you don't need to worry about the maximum residue level. Which of those is the correct answer? All right. Give just a few more seconds. All right. Pretty much everyone's responded. Oh, perfect. Everyone responded. Nick of time.
Okay. So 93% of you know that MRLs are important when you are working with an export commodity. Okay. So they may be more strict than our US established tolerances, which is to say you could be following all label instructions and you won't exceed the tolerance, but you still might not be able to export it to some other country. So if you are working with a commodity with a cooperator who exports their, product, then you need to be very aware of what the MRLs are. Or maybe, what the thing is, your cooperator is going to be aware. They're going to know what pesticides would cause them a problem with exporting, but it's really good to communicate that. So the global MRL database is now part of Bryant Christie, whatever that is, but they maintain this database. And so I think I did this for chlorpyrifos. So you can look up the commodity, the active ingredient, and then the markets. I hope that you can see this, but I've got nuts, nut, almonds. The pesticide is chlorpyrifos, is active ingredient, so it's not by product or registration number. And I've checked off the markets for the EU, Japan, Codex, which is an international standard that some countries accept and some don't. So it might be, like completely irrelevant. And then Korea. Okay. So I go here and it's here. So chlorpyrifos applied to almonds, the federal tolerance is 0.2. Is it parts? I'm going to assume parts per million, but I must have cut off the screenshot. So it's 0.2 parts per million. But the Codex, EU, and Korea have an import tolerance of 0.05 parts per billion. So they don't accept as much chlorpyrifos residue on their commodities. Japan is equivalent to the United States. Okay. So you would need to know at harvest if you've exceeded, the MRL in addition to, the tolerance. But this is only in certain circumstances. So I want to talk about groundwater protection, but as it relates to the policy. So earlier we talked about the research authorization and how for following our policy, most experimental pesticide uses do not require a research authorization from DPR. Special permission from DPR to do some research. We don't have to request it. There's two situations in which we do. One, if we're applying groundwater polluting chemicals in a groundwater protection area, we do have to get a research authorization. Or two, if we're doing genetically modified microbial pesticide applications. So if you're genetically modifying microbes, then you have to get a research authorization. I'm not actually going to talk about that because I've never talked to anybody in all my years that is doing that. But I do want to talk about groundwater protection and how to know what are the groundwater polluting chemicals and how to know if you're in a groundwater protection area. Okay. So I just said all of this. Okay. So there is a list of herbicides. They're soil applied herbicides. They're in the California Code of Regulations, section 6800. There's two lists of pesticides in that section. The A list is those that are known to be found in groundwater. Like we're going to be finding if nobody applies a single drop of atrazine from now until the end of time, we will still be finding atrazine in our groundwater. It's just there. It's going to be there forever because it leaches, and that's all there is to it. Even if you, yeah, anyways, it's just easier to leach. It's very persistent and somewhat soluble. Anyway, so these are pesticides that we know are going to make it to groundwater. So we restrict them in groundwater sensitive areas. Okay. There's also a B list, and they're not restricted, but they're active ingredients that we think are probably going to end up in ground or surface water if we're not careful. And so DPR reserves the right to monitor for the 100 and something active ingredients that are in the B list. But that's all I'm going to say about the B list. Let's focus on the A list. Okay. Because these are like the real deal here. So if you are applying any of these active ingredients in a research trial, in a groundwater protection area, you are not exempt from a research authorization or a restricted materials permit. So you no longer get those exemptions. I don't believe anybody is doing this, but this is good information, even if you're not including these active ingredients in your research trials, because it could be really good information for local growers or what have you. So these are pesticides that, because of their chemistry and because of the way that they're applied, they're soil applied, they're directly to the soil. They're probably somewhat soluble, and they're persistent, meaning they last in the environment for a long time. So unless you do a superb job of water management and management of your application, they're likely going to end up in groundwater. They just are. So certain counties have groundwater protection areas, and this is a California law or a California regulation. This isn't an EPA thing. And so based on the environmental factors of that area of land, DPR has determined if that, square of land is prone to contamination or not. And if it is, then it's a groundwater protection area. It's just a combination of looking at depth to groundwater and the soil characteristics. Okay. So if you go to this website, I just go to Google California groundwater protection areas. It just takes me right where I want to go. And I click on one of these two. I can't remember. This one, this one's a different color. So I think this is where I went. Groundwater protection area lists. And then you get a list of counties that have a groundwater protection area in them. And then you click on your county. And in this case, I clicked on Riverside County. So the grayed out sections are not Riverside County. The white background is Riverside County. Okay. And so anything that, these I have to step back just a second. These maps look just a tiny bit different. They're harder to read. So they've made that improvement to make them harder to read because we love that. But so I kept the old map because it's just easier for me to see the color coding on this map. But anyways, you'll notice that there's some areas of this county are not white, right? They're yellow, blue, or orange, but they're squares. Anybody want to guess why these are squares? So I'll just tell you. If you want to guess, put it in the chat. But they're squares because, it's township range and sections. So these squares are like the 1 mile sections. Okay. So anyways, somewhere, if your section is coded a color, for example, if it's yellow, that means you're in an area that is prone to leaching. If you're blue, means you're in an area that is prone to runoff. And if you're in orange, you're in an area that's prone to runoff or leaching. Okay. I don't know why the third color isn't the combination of the first two colors. I mean, if you ask me, that's how I would do it. But anyways, I'm a little stickler for colors. So if you go to this groundwater protection area site on DPR and you look at this map and you're like, oh, I'm in this square and it is yellow. Not everywhere in that square is actually a groundwater sensitive area. It really just depends, you know, on the soil and then the depth to groundwater. So if you find yourself, for example, in this area right here, then you would need to go to your county ag commissioner's office and request a more detailed map. So if your research plot is in one of these squares, you have to ask for a more detailed map. And if your research plot happens to be in that actual groundwater protection area, then you cannot apply any of these pesticides without a research authorization and a restricted materials permit. Okay, because these are known to reach groundwater, and these are landforms where groundwater is very sensitive to contamination. Okay, well, obviously, and surface water as well. So any questions on the groundwater protection part of our policy? I'm going to skip ahead a couple slides because I said this already. Okay. So if there are no questions on groundwater protection and how to know if you're in a groundwater protection area, I want to move on to supervisor responsibilities. And we have some definitions in the policy. So a supervisor, according to this policy, is not always like the person who signs the timesheet. Okay. It's an employee of the UC working as a researcher, project leader, principal investigator, or just a designated person responsible for this research project. If you are supervising this research project, you are the supervisor for all intents and purposes of the people working on that research project. So sometimes they are your direct report and sometimes they're not, right? And sometimes I know we have county employees who are working for many people. Okay, so you may be their supervisor on your research projects, but then they may have a different supervisor on different research projects that they do work on. Okay, and so basically the reason we are defining supervisor is because somebody who's in charge of this research project, the supervisor, is likely the person with the QAL or QAC, could be different, could be multiple on that project, but also you're just responsible for making sure the employee is protected in the way that they are supposed to be protected. Okay. I know that our supervisors are also employees, but you're kind of in charge. So you get to determine if you give yourself the protections that you deserve or not, right? So a supervisor is responsible for providing a safe work environment and providing training to people that are working on this project under their direction. I'm not saying you have to be the one to give them training. You have to provide access to training for them during work hours. You need to ensure by training your staff and by supervising this application that pesticides are used in accordance with state, federal laws, regulations, label requirements. So you are responsible, okay? You can delegate some of your authority, but you are the one who needs to be able to check off that list. Yep, I did this. Yes, I did this. Yes, this is being done. Okay. So supervisors are required to make sure employees are aware of the hazards of the chemicals and pesticides being used for experimentation. Okay. And you can use the pesticide label as a guide to employee training required. But if you don't have a registered label, you should have a safety data sheet. So now, because of our worker protection regulations, we have to have a label. If you have a label, you have to have the label, right? But we also have to provide access to the safety data sheets to our employees, even if we have a label. And even if we're following the instructions on the label, the safety data sheet gives safety information, long-term health information, right? It has some information that the label does not have. So we always have to provide our employees access to the safety data sheets for the pesticides they're applying and coming into contact with. And then if you don't have a registered label, then you have to, your SDS is your guide for first aid, for PPE, for just all kinds of things. Okay. So an employee of UC is any person whose current UC position description or ag experiment station project description includes responsibilities for pest management, research, and demonstration. So somebody may be getting their paycheck from a county, but they're working on with A&R academics on pesticide research trials. So as far as this policy is concerned, you're an employee of the UC. Oh, I just already said, I said that. So just in general, the supervisor shall meet the requirements for state regulations. So working alone with pesticides, oh, that's where that question came up last time. This is not in the policy per se. These are regulations that are in the California code that everybody has to follow. They're not special to us. So I'm basically done talking about how UC researchers are special. From here on out, not really. Oh, so from here on out, I'm going to talk about what everybody has to do, including us, and I'll point out where we're a little bit different. So from here forward, I'm talking about what everybody has to do, including us, and I'll point out the exceptions. Okay. So we have to have a clothing change. These are just regulatory sections that we're simply not exempt from. And they're all related to safety of employees. So let's talk about personal protective equipment, because as a supervisor, if you're making the application, you need to wear it. If you're supervising other applicators, you need to make sure they have the appropriate PPE. So I don't know why it says poll 4. I'm very sorry.
It took me a second and then I remembered this one was funky. So, okay. So the poll is asking, in California, most pesticide handlers have to wear a minimum of what PPE? You can choose all that you think apply. So the options are waterproof gloves, chemical resistant gloves, a respirator, long pants, long sleeve shirt, closed toed shoes, socks, and last but not least, protective eyewear. What do you think are the minimum PPE requirements for a handler in California? All right, I'll give just a couple more seconds. There's quite a few to click on, hint, hint. All right, I'm going to end it and share the results.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So I wonder, I might just go to my next slide. I don't know. Let's go through this. I want to give you the answers in this format, and then we'll reiterate. So waterproof gloves are not minimum requirements. It's chemical resistant gloves. Okay. Chemical resistant gloves are waterproof, but not all waterproof gloves are chemical resistant. Okay. So it's chemical resistant gloves. So respirator is not always required. That's only required if the label indicates. Long pants, long sleeve shirt, closed-toed shoes and socks, always required. Okay. And protective eyewear required in almost every situation. So here we go. So here, let's reiterate. This is the minimum PPE. So this is Miguel. If you've been to any of my trainings, you've met Miguel. And maybe you've met Miguel in real life. Some people have. I haven't. But anyways, it's such a shame. So Miguel is wearing long sleeve shirt, long pants, socks, closed-toed shoes. And he's fine if he's going out into a field to take samples, soil samples, leaf samples, do some cultural activities like moving irrigation pipe and things like that. He's wearing the appropriate work clothing, but he is not appropriately dressed for handling pesticides in California. Okay. So he needs to also add chemical resistant gloves. I've pictured nitrile gloves because we all recognize them, but it just depends on which gloves. Okay, the gloves you wear depend. And protective eyewear. So for almost every single handling task as an employee, you need to be wearing everything that Miguel's wearing, not the exact same thing, you know, choose your own style, but also protective eyewear and chemical resistant gloves. Okay. So this is found in section 6738 of the California Code of Regulation, which is exactly to say that sometimes the minimum requirements for PPE in California are not found on a pesticide label. These labels are usually registered in California, but that there's not a California specific label. They don't put all of our California specific regulations on a federal label, simply not there. So you have to follow at a minimum what the label says, and then you have to follow what the California code says if it's different. So 6738 requires protective eyewear and chemical resistant gloves for most handling tasks, and then coveralls for certain pesticides. Okay. So when I say protective eyewear, I'm talking about safety glasses, goggles, or a face shield. So all three of these count as protective eyewear. So all three of these must be Z87.1 compliant. That's a measure of impact resistance. And it is indicated on the plastic part of the protective eyewear. I'll show you in just a second a better picture of this, but they all need to have front, side, and brow protection. So these are like lab glasses right over here on the bottom left-hand side. So they do have side protection, like more so than a regular safety glass, right? Safety glasses. But even safety glasses that don't have this full-on side shield can have front, side, and brow protection. They just have to conform to the curvature of your face, right? So my glasses don't conform. They go straight across. So I have a little gap here, a bigger, big gap, right? Where with curved glasses conforming to my face, there's the same small gap all the way around, and that counts as side protection. Although I really do prefer these, frankly, they just cover more. They've got the shelf up here and they've got the shield on the side. Perfect. So this is what I mean by Z87. So you can see it right here. Look, I have this fancy thing and I'm going to do it. I'm going to use it right here. It's Z87 plus, which is more protective than Z87.1. Okay. So it is raised lettering, but it's clear lettering on clear plastic, which is not easy to see. And so you can feel around, but look, there's other raised lettering right here. It's the brand name. So it doesn't tell you anything about its impact resistance. And there's other letters that I found that are raised on the thing. So you have to be sure that it says Z87 plus or 0.1. And when you purchase your protective eyewear, you should be able to see in the technical specifications of the eyewear, like the product details, it should tell you if it's Z87.1 or plus or something else. Okay, so let me go back to this. So, so if your label doesn't say anything about protective eyewear, you get to choose which one of these you use. If your label just says protective eyewear, again, you get to choose the best situation for you, the best choice for you. But if your label specifies goggles, you cannot wear safety glasses. This is like the hierarchy of protection, essentially. So if they say goggles or face shield, you can't wear glasses. If they say face shield, you can't wear goggles. Okay? So if it's specified on the label what protective eyewear, what specific protective eyewear you have to wear, then you have to wear that. If not, then you get to choose. So when I say chemical resistant gloves, I'm talking about gloves that are made of any of these chemical resistant materials. So give me a second here. I wanted to change the color. I can't. I mean, I can, but I don't know how. Here we go. So any of these, I told it to make it red, but it did not listen to me. Okay. So any of these materials listed here are considered chemical resistant. So laminate, oh, I don't have my gloves in here. I'm sorry. Are the Silver Shield, they go, there's spaceman gloves. Butyl, usually they're black, but not always. Nitrile, you guys are familiar with that. Neoprene are chemical resistant gloves. Natural does not mean natural fabric. It means natural rubber, because many of these are in this list are synthetic rubbers. So they just didn't take the time or space to add natural rubber. And you know your gloves are natural rubber because they smell like rubber. And your hands will smell like rubber for days later. Polyethylene is a chemical resistant material, polyvinyl chloride, and Viton. So here, this is very important. All but laminate and polyethylene, okay, these two are actually barrier materials. They're not great with dexterity, but they are a complete barrier to absorption of liquids. So they are not required to have any minimum thickness, whereas all of the other chemical resistant materials on this list have to be at least 14 mils thick. So laminate, any thickness. Polyethylene, any thickness. Everything else has to be a minimum of 14 mils or thicker. But some of you some of you wear disposable gloves. Oops, I'm not going to get there yet. Some of you wear disposable gloves, and if you do, they're very likely to be less than 15 mils thick. So you can wear them if they're made out of any of these materials. Usually they're made out of nitrile or neoprene. You need to know how thick they are if they're disposable, because if they're less than 14 mils thick, then you can wear them for dexterity, like tasks that require dexterity. So like if you've got a small bottle, if you're messing around with nozzles, if you're fixing application equipment, you're measuring out small quantities, you can wear them, but not for more than 15 minutes at a time. Okay. So you have to change to a different pair of gloves if you've been wearing those disposables for more than 15 minutes. There are disposable gloves that are nitrile that are 15 mils thick. And so you could wear those for your entire application as long as they don't break, or right. Anytime your gloves break, disposable or not, you have to change them. I mean, I think that goes without saying. So there is this provision where you could wear disposable gloves, but how long you can wear them depends on the thickness. So coveralls are important because obviously you have to wear them if that is stated on the label. And you have to wear them when you're handling danger or warning pesticides. So this part is the California Code of Regulation. So if the signal word on your EPA registered label is danger or warning, California says you have to wear coveralls. And coveralls can actually be these tightly woven cotton, but then your employer has to provide for laundering. So it could be Tyvek as well, or like some similar material. So, but also you should wear coveralls if in the course of your pesticide application, your clothes are getting wet. So maybe you're not required to wear coveralls by the label or by the signal word. But if you are out there making an application and your work clothes are getting wet, you should be wearing a coverall. If your work clothes are getting wet with pesticides, then those pesticides are absorbing into your skin. And that's not what's supposed to happen. So just be cognizant. If you're in an open cab and you're doing some air blast spray, you're probably going to get wet and you're going to need some coveralls.